The air was heavy with sorrow as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a somber glow over Jerusalem. On a rugged cross atop Golgotha, Jesus of Nazareth hung lifeless, his body bruised and broken. After hours of unimaginable agony, he had uttered his final words. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Luke 23:46. With that, his head bowed and his breath ceased. The world fell silent, as if all of nature stood still in reverence. But what the onlookers could not see was that this moment was no mere end. It was the beginning of a journey unlike any other. The crowd scattered, some in tears, others jeering, oblivious to the divine shift that had begun. The earth trembled, rocks split, and the veil of the temple tore from top to bottom, Matthew 27:50-53. Tombs cracked open, and the bodies of saints long dead stirred, as if awakened by an unseen force. These were not random events. They were signs that the death of this man was no ordinary death. Beyond the eyes of the living, a sacred mystery was unfolding. Jesus' body was taken down, wrapped in linen, and laid in a tomb, sealed by a stone and guarded by soldiers. To the disciples, it was the end of hope. To the Pharisees, it was the end of a threat. But in the spiritual realms, it marked the dawn of a divine triumph. The Son of God, though dead in the flesh, was alive in spirit, his authority undiminished. As he had declared, "No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again." John 10:18. Where did Jesus go in those 3 days between his death and resurrection? The answer lies not in the tomb where his body rested, but in the unseen realms where his spirit moved with purpose. The scriptures speak of Sheol, a realm where the souls of the righteous and the wicked await in separate domains. It was to this mysterious domain that Jesus descended, not as a captive, but as a conqueror. His journey began not in the heavens, but in the heart of the earth, as foretold by David. "You will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see decay." Psalm 16:10. While the world mourned or rejoiced, Jesus crossed the threshold of death. The physical tomb was silent, but the spiritual realms were trembling. The Redeemer's mission was far from finished. It was now entering its most mysterious chapter. What awaited him in the depths? Who would he encounter? And what was the purpose of his descent into the shadowy heart of existence? Sheol, the Hebrew realm of the dead, was a stark reality. It was a real, spiritual domain, a place where the souls of the departed awaited their ultimate destiny. Jesus himself had described its structure in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, Luke 16:19-31. The bosom of Abraham offered comfort to the righteous who died in faith, while the wicked endured torment, divided by an uncrossable gulf. This was the stage upon which the next act of redemption would unfold. As Jesus' spirit descended into Sheol, the atmosphere shifted. The righteous, resting in Abraham's bosom, felt a divine tremor, as if the promise they had held in life was now approaching. Men like Abel, Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, and countless others who had trusted in God's covenant waited in this sacred pause. They were not in torment, but neither were they in the fullness of God's presence. Their faith had sustained them, but the final redemption had not yet come, until now. On the other side of the great chasm, the wicked languished in agony. The rich man of Jesus' parable cried out for a drop of water, his torment unrelieved, his fate sealed, Luke 16:24. These souls who had rejected God's mercy in life now faced the consequences of their choices. The chasm ensured no crossing, no reprieve. Even here, Jesus' presence stirred fear, for the light of the world was piercing the realm of shadows. But Sheol held more than human souls. Deeper still, in a place of even greater shadow, were the spirits in prison. beings not of flesh, but of a different order. These were the fallen angels, rebels from the days of Noah, who had transgressed divine boundaries and brought corruption to the earth. Genesis 6:1-4. Jude 6 speaks of them, the angels who did not keep their positions of authority, but abandoned their proper dwelling. These he has kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day. Their rebellion had earned them a place of confinement, a prison within Sheol, where they awaited their final judgment. Jesus descended not as a mere traveler, but with unwavering purpose. He moved with purpose, his authority radiating like a beacon in the gloom. The righteous sensed hope, the wicked trembled in dread, and the imprisoned spirits, locked in their chains, would soon hear a proclamation that would shake the foundations of their rebellion. The heart of the earth, as Jesus had called it, Matthew 12:40, was about to witness the fulfillment of a promise made long before the world began. In the darkest depths of Sheol, untouched by earthly light, Jesus stood before the imprisoned spirits. These were not human souls, but angelic beings who had defied God's order in the days before the flood. Their rebellion had steeped the world in corruption, prompting God to send the flood to purify it. Genesis 6:5-7. Now, bound in chains of darkness, they languished in a prison of their own making, their rebellion a distant memory, but their judgment still to come. The scriptures reveal this moment in 1 Peter 3:18-20. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. After being made alive, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, to those who were disobedient long ago when God waited patiently in the days of Noah. This proclamation was no call to repentance or mercy. It was a bold decree of triumph. What did Jesus say to these spirits? The Bible does not record his exact words, but their weight can be felt. He stood before them, the Son of God, the one born of a woman, the seed promised in Eden who would crush the serpent's head. Genesis 3:15. His presence was a living testament to their defeat. The cross, which they had thought was their triumph, had become their undoing. The plan they had sought to thwart, God's redemption of humanity, had been fulfilled. Imagine the scene, a prison of eternal darkness, where hope had long since faded. The spirits, once mighty, now trembled as the Redeemer's voice resounded in their prison. This was no offer of salvation, but a decree of sovereignty. Jesus proclaimed that the cross had triumphed, that the rebellion of ages past had been judged, and that the authority of the Almighty now rested in his hands. The powers of darkness, which had gloated at his death, now realized their error. The Lamb who was slain was alive, and he stood in their midst as conqueror. This proclamation was not only for the imprisoned spirits, it echoed as a divine decree across all spiritual realms. The spiritual realms, from the highest heavens to the deepest abyss, reverberated with the truth that the Son of Man had fulfilled the Father's will. The gates of Sheol could not hold him, and the chains of death could not bind him. But Jesus' mission in Sheol was not yet complete. While the spirits in prison recoiled at his words, another group awaited him, the righteous, who had longed for this day. In Abraham's bosom, where the righteous of old found rest, they awaited their Redeemer. These were the heroes of faith described in Hebrews 11, who died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar. Abraham, who believed God's covenant, Moses, who led Israel through the wilderness, David, who sang of the Messiah, and countless others rested here, their souls sustained by the hope of redemption. They were not in torment, but they were not yet in the fullness of God's presence. The way to the heavenly Holy of Holies had not yet been opened. Jesus' arrival in this sacred space was a moment of unparalleled glory. The righteous, who had lived by faith, now saw the promise standing before them. He was no mere vision or promise. He was the living fulfillment of God's every word. His presence radiant with glory, he transformed Abraham's bosom from a haven of waiting into a realm of victory. The words of Ephesians 4:8-10 come to life. When he ascended on high, he took many captives and gave gifts to his people. What does he ascended mean, except that he also descended to the lower earthly regions? With the keys of death and Hades in his hands, Revelation 1:18, Jesus was not merely a visitor. He was the liberator. The righteous could not escape Sheol, for the redeeming blood had not yet been offered. But now, with the cross behind him, Jesus had paid the price. The veil of the temple had torn, Matthew 27:51, signifying that the way to God was open. The blood of the Lamb had satisfied divine justice, and the path to heaven was clear. In a moment that echoed the Exodus from Egypt, Jesus led the righteous out of Sheol. This was no mere metaphor. It was a literal spiritual migration. Matthew 27:52-53 hints at the magnitude of this event. The tombs broke open, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. These saints, freed from Sheol, were a testimony to the power of Christ's descent and ascent. Abraham's bosom stood empty, its sacred role complete. The righteous, who had waited for centuries, now followed their Redeemer in a glorious procession to the heavens. This was the great spiritual exodus, not from a land of slavery, but from the confines of death itself. The chasm that separated the righteous from the wicked remained, but the righteous were no longer bound by it. They were free, led by the one who had conquered death. Jesus' descent into Sheol was more than proclamation and liberation. It was a conquest. The scriptures paint death as humanity's great enemy, a consequence of the fall that separated mankind from God, Genesis 3:19. Satan, the accuser, had used the fear of death to enslave humanity, Hebrews 2:14-15. But Jesus came to dismantle this empire from within. When Jesus died, he did not succumb to death. He entered it deliberately as the one who holds authority over life and death. His sinless sacrifice on the cross disarmed the powers of darkness, as Colossians 2:15 declares, and having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. The cross was not the end of his mission, it was the means by which he invaded the domain of death. In Sheol, Jesus took the keys of death and Hades, as he later proclaimed, "I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades." Revelation 1:18. These keys signified unchallenged authority over death and Hades. Death, once an unconquerable foe, now answered to the risen one. Hades, the realm of the dead, was no longer a prison for those who belonged to God. This conquest went unheard by mortals, but it echoed powerfully across the spiritual realms. The powers that had ruled through fear were stripped of their dominion. The gates of Hades, which Jesus had promised would not prevail against his church, Matthew 16:18, were now under his control. The psalmist's words found their fulfillment. "Lift up your heads, you gates. Be lifted up, you ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in." Psalm 24:7. The 3 days in the heart of the earth were not a time of waiting, but of action. Jesus moved through Sheol with purpose, shattering its hold over the righteous and declaring his victory over its darkest inhabitants. The tomb's silence hid the profound upheaval unfolding in the unseen world. The King of glory had entered the stronghold of death and emerged as its master. The third day dawned, the tomb still sealed, its guards unaware of what had unfolded. But in the spiritual realms, the mission was nearing its climax. Jesus had proclaimed his victory to the spirits in prison, liberated the righteous from the bosom of Abraham, and taken the keys of death and Hades. Now he prepared to ascend to the heavenly throne of God. Hebrews 9:12 describes this sacred moment. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. This was not the earthly temple, but the heavenly Holy of Holies, the very presence of God. Jesus, the eternal high priest, presented his own blood as the sacrifice that fulfilled every requirement of divine justice. The redemption of humanity was complete. As he ascended, Jesus led the multitude of liberated saints from Sheol into the presence of God. This was the fulfillment of Ephesians 4:8. When he ascended on high, he took many captives. The righteous, who had clung to faith, now stepped into the eternal glory promised them. The bosom of Abraham was no longer needed, the way to heaven was open, and the saints of old became the first to walk it. On earth, the stone was rolled away, and the tomb was found empty. The resurrection was not the start of Jesus' victory, but its radiant proof. He had already triumphed in the unseen realms, defeating death, liberating the captives, and presenting his sacrifice before the Father. The empty tomb was the final proclamation to the world. The King of Glory had conquered. The 3 days between the cross and the resurrection were not a time of defeat or dormancy. They were a journey of triumph, a mission that reshaped the spiritual landscape of existence. Jesus descended to the heart of the earth, confronted the powers of darkness, freed the righteous, and claimed authority over death itself. His ascent to the heavenly sanctuary sealed the redemption that the cross had purchased. This is the mystery of those 3 days, a journey not of silence, but of sovereignty, not of defeat, but of dominion. The cross was not the end, but the bridge between heaven and earth. The tomb was not a prison, but a gateway to glory. And Jesus, the Son of God, bridged heaven and earth, ensuring that neither death nor Hades nor the deepest darkness could ever separate humanity from God's love.